Hello, everyone, and welcome back to News from Nowhere, Scotia's weekly news podcast, bringing you the headlines. My name is Colm McHale. Today is Sunday, the 9th of August, and I am joined, as ever, by Samuel Raphael Williams. Sam, how are things?
Yeah, I'm well, Cole, and it's good to be here on another Sunday, talk about the news of the week. We've got some really interesting stories to discuss, I think.
Yeah, we do, and I'm actually in quite a good mood because Hibs have just beaten Rangers at Ibrox, which is cause for celebration wherever you are in the country. So good news to start off the podcast. And I suppose with that, I should say that if you're in a financial position to support our output, you can do so on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint a month. If you're not, then please do review the podcast wherever you're listening because it helps us tremendously with the algorithm. If you're watching on YouTube, navigate to the bottom of your screen and do subscribe to our channel. We also have a mailing list and a WhatsApp channel, as I plug every week, and you're tired of hearing, but please do support us however you can. And with that, let's move into this week's headlines. Sam, do you want to kick us off this week?
Yeah, I'm going to return to climate news, which I'm sure is something that a lot of our listeners are hearing everywhere, and that's because it's very, very important. I want to highlight the heatwave conditions returning to England for the fifth time this summer. This taking place while northwest Scotland has been hit by half a month's rainfall in just 2 days. All this comes after July has been determined to be the driest July in England and Wales since records began in 1836. Obviously, this playing a huge role in fueling the ongoing drought and wildfires in parts of England, in Wales as well, and also in Scotland. But these very opposed meteorological conditions kind of over the last week between different locations on the same island, I think go to show the variety that extreme weather can have, and the need to properly develop emergency services that can deal with kind of, not only potential flood conditions on both coasts and in urban areas, but also being equipped to manage wildfires under dry conditions. And I think it also, this is raising big questions for me about the distribution of natural resources across the British Isles. And I personally kind of anticipate that water will increasingly become a big political issue in Britain, not just in terms of ownership, which it already is, but increasingly in terms of scarcity and distribution. And if we anticipate that drought is soon to become kind of a worsening annual experience in England, the abundance of fresh water in Scotland, I think, will surely come into play in a significant way down the line politically. So I just wanted to highlight that kind of environmental meteorological news.
What you've just said dovetails very nicely with my own first headline of the week, which is the consequent price rises following the heat wave, really emphasizing the extent to which climate change is impacting the cost of living. So the wholesale price of tomatoes is up by more than 60% at the moment. It's up by 90% for iceberg lettuce and up by 40% on potatoes. That's as a number of farmers struggle to grow in consistently high temperatures. Even those with irrigation systems and reservoirs on their farms say water is running low. Broccoli growers say their yield has halved. And this comes as the UN report global food prices have now reached their highest level in 3.5 years since the 2022 spike. Cereal prices rose by 3.4% month on month in July, including a 5.8% increase in global wheat costs. These are scary figures that come not just as a consequence of accelerated climate change, but war abroad, and particularly in the Middle East, which is central to globalized production, as we know. And of course, none of this, and it's important in the context of what Sam just said, has provoked a response yet from the British Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. It's incredible that he's managed to last this long without saying a word on it. But perhaps, given the cost of living context, he will be forced to in the week to come. Sam, what's your next headline?
I will get on to the next headline. Just a quick comment on what you've said. Not only is it stunning that the new prime minister is not mentioned or made a public statement about these kind of crisis conditions caused by climate change. But there are still people on national radio, and national television and commentators that are trying to play this down to this day as we're literally seeing the consequences of climate change bite, right? And I think the reason for this is that this is being distilled through the culture war framing, which is something which is, literally um, the one thing that could not be that is not applicable to the culture war framing. But this is something we're going to continue to return to on News from Nowhere quite regularly. I think I wanted to my next headline bring it a bit more local, and I wanted to highlight this major row which is potentially brewing over the decision of administrators of the former Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow to auction off the archive of that institution, which includes, according to a report from the Glasgow Bell, I quote, film records, photographic records, flyers, posters, and ephemera from decades of arts events and initiatives in Scotland. This is obviously hugely controversial given the millions in public money invested in the CCA over many, many years. The article in the Glasgow Bell highlighted the comments of the 16-year Creative Scotland portfolio manager. Her name is Amanda Cato, who on Instagram urged politicians to step in to protect this collection. In her words, I quote, "If an archive of this importance can be treated simply as an asset to be realized, what protection exists for the documentary history of other nationally significant cultural organizations?" A campaign group, end quote, by the way. And campaign group Save Our CCA has launched a campaign and petition to preserve various elements of the institution, including the archive, but also the CCA buildings themselves, which are due to go on sale.
I'm going to talk a bit about party membership numbers next, and we're going to dwell on this a lot today. But let's start with the Labour Party figures, which have just been released as a result of the publication of accounts by the Electoral Commission. Labour Party membership across the UK dropped by more than a fifth in 2025, with a member quitting the party every 8 minutes. The party's membership now stands at 264,754. That's the lowest it has been for a decade, and down from a peak of 564,000 in 2017. Income from membership fees also dropped, as you would expect, given the fact 300,000 people have left the party in the last 9 years, by almost 17%. While income from affiliates, that's trade unions and socialist societies, has also fallen by almost 4%, which is indicative of a broader trend that we're seeing across the Labour movement, where unions are going increasingly cold on the party. It might change as a result of Andy Burnham. These are figures that date to September 25. We don't know what the current number is, but the trend speaks for itself. Let's move on now to our substantive stories of the week, beginning, as I said a moment ago, with membership figures, but this time for the Scottish National Party. SNP membership has fallen below 51,000 and was down about 5,000 from previous year's figures at the end of 2025. Like the Labour Party numbers, that's according to accounts published by the Electoral Commission. This is down on the 64,000 figure that the SNP reported. That can't be right. Sorry, I'm going to start this again.
Yeah, no worries.
Let's move on to our substantive stories for the week, beginning with the news that SNP membership has fallen below 51,000. That's according to accounts published by the Electoral Commission. Like with the Labour Party figures, it's worth saying that we don't have the data for Scottish Labour specifically, because that figure is published as a UK whole. So this 51,000 figure for the SNP is down on the 64,525 members that the party had in 2024. The party's membership peaked at 125,000 in 2019. So this is a significant drop off of more than half the SNP's membership in the last 7 years, attributable to a whole variety of factors which we should talk about. But as a result of this declining membership, the party has had to make quite significant cuts. The Electoral Commission's report suggests the SNP has culled around a quarter of their HQ staff, which fell from 26 to 19. The result of that cut has been the party has been able to reverse the deficit in which it found itself, producing a surplus of more than £500,000. So these are quite interesting figures which reveal a long-term trend, which is declining participation within the party of government in Scotland and declining at quite a significant rate. Sam, what did you make of the SNP's collapse in membership over the last 6-7 years?
Yeah, so obviously this is you know, very bad news for the party. There's no way that you can spin it, especially given its aspirations to continue being the kind of hegemonic party in Scotland. Um, and this kind of considerable reduction in membership figures, I think, means not only that the SNP has far fewer resources to draw on, obviously, in terms of not just membership fees, but also in terms of activists to go canvassing, run local meetings. But I think it also means that, you know, as I think we saw with the decline in membership in the UK Labour Party as well, those tens of thousands of members lost are now out there potentially to be picked up by other parties now or in the future, meaning that those same members could become activists working for different parties against the SNP in future elections. And I have no doubt that that dynamic was at play in 2026 with the Greens. I'm surely having picked up a few of those SNP members, right? At least a few, and certainly having a much stronger presence on the streets, at least where I am, in the constituencies where they were running constituency candidates. And as you mentioned, with respect to this Electoral Commission information, it should be said, obviously, it's interesting that the SNP's now, managed to produce a surplus of £500,000 despite this. This is surely due, to slightly more prudent fiscal management and job cuts, which I wasn't actually aware of, Cole, which is very interesting. I'm of the view that this surplus should just be refunded directly to those who had their money embezzled in the Murrell situation. To be honest, I said in a previous program that Swain should try and raise this money from SNP MSP salaries, right? But clearly this not entirely necessary, and I think that this would go. You should just organize a mass refund straight away, and I think it would go some way to restoring their credibility. But I think this is obviously not likely to happen. I don't think that the SNP leadership feels accountable to those people, right? So yeah, that's not how they're going to use these new resources. But as you mentioned, Cole, the decline in membership and political participation is an issue that is Scotland-wide and probably UK-wide. Membership numbers are also declining in civil society as well as in formal politics. And I think as well as being a feature of people just tightening their belts and reducing their subscriptions, I think it's a feature of, more importantly, of general disenchantment with civic and political participation. And people have quite good reasons for feeling this way, to be frank. But this story, Cole, reminded me of a conversation we had a while ago, actually, closer to when we first met, which is to do with entryism, actually. And it seems to me that while this is obviously bad for the SNP, it perhaps makes it more fertile ground for more left-leaning and perhaps even socialist identifying individuals to try and get into the party. Obviously, the fewer members in the SNP, the more influence socialist members could have from one perspective. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about that question call. Now that we've seen these numbers, do you think that that's a possibility, or is that far too optimistic?
I think it's actually interesting to play with precisely because of why I think it's a bad or at least fruitless pursuit, right? Like part of the reason why we've seen this decline in membership within the SNP is precisely because of what you just said, Sam. You said that the leadership doesn't feel accountable to its membership. And that's what's led to alienation among the base of people who joined the party following the referendum in 2014. So I think that the SNP's membership prior to the beginning of that campaign was around 20,000. Um, so we're still talking about a party which is almost three times the size it was 15 years ago, but we're not talking about a party which is closer to 5 or 6 times the size it was 15 years ago, as it was in 2019. And I think what's happened in the in between time, if you like, is that the means by which members can feed into and affect policy within the SNP have been systematically removed. Right. And this is a long process which begins at the turn of the century. I mean, let's not forget, Mike Russell was referred to as Mick Mandelson for a reason during the process of new liberalisation within the party. And I think that this is something which ultimately rears its head with regard to engagement within the party. Those who joined the Scottish National Party after the referendum were activists. They were people who had pounded the pavement for the Yes campaign in 2014 and wanted something to do. The SNP hasn't given its members anything to do for a very long time now. In fact, that threshold for active participation within the party as late as 2019 was reasonably low. To become a member of a political party, well, all you have to do is sign a form online, right? You're not asked to do particularly much. So while this is evidence of declining participation within our political sphere, it's actually is actually evidence of something less than declining participation, given the threshold to actually merit political activity has been considered so low for such a long time as a result of the extent to which collective life on this island has been dismantled. That's a political project, of course, over the last 40 years. So I think there's lots to read into these numbers. Anton Jaeger talks about hyperpolitics and the return of politics to our society. We are out with the end of history moment now, but what we haven't got is the return of organisations which underpinned political involvement prior to the rise of neoliberalism. Instead, politics happens at a particularly superficial level. Everything is political, but there's nothing beneath that politics. And to an extent, this is evidence enough of that. There is high polarisation within Scottish society. Everyone has a view on the Constitution, but very few people, and less, are engaging to further their viewpoint or realize it in the case of independence. Now that reveals the fundamental problem for the SNP is the inability to galvanize with an intellectual case for independence, the base that it has galvanized in the past with the promise of independence in 2014. And I think that is what is broadly at the crux of the declining membership, alongside the scandals and the embezzlement charges that we've seen dominate the news in the first 6 to 8 months of this year in particular. So I think that there is lots at play here. Um, I think it's worth probably also mentioning the fact that the party is empty of politics more broadly, right? So if you were someone who attempted to influence the SNP's policy platform from the left, as you've discussed, we've seen that happen over the last 7 years, and we've seen the extent to which the leadership has been successful in batting those people off. Um, so what you have effectively now is a shell. Scottish National Party is a shell with a very clear hard cadre developed at the top and nothing beneath, right? 50,000 people, yes, but we know that turnout in leadership elections is smaller. We know that turnout in NEC elections is even smaller. We know that delegates to conference are dropping off all the time. So what you have is a hard shell which does the work of the ruling class in Scotland at a political level in Holyrood, and is able to handle the day to day, the facilitation of broadly social democratic capitalism in Scotland with a heavy focus on foreign investment, as we well know. But beneath that, there's not much, and the levers to influence that are declining. And I think this actually moves us on quite nicely to our second major story of the week, and that is the criticism offered by Nicola Sturgeon of her party in the foreword to the second edition of her memoir. Frankly, as it's called, of course. Nicola Sturgeon wrote that in May's Holyrood election, there was a lack of vision or big picture thinking when it came to the SNP's campaign. In her view, the SNP was lucky the Scottish Greens did not stand in more constituencies, suggesting that had they done so, they would have eaten into John Swinney's 58-seat tally. It was the Greens, said Sturgeon, who'd come closest to injecting a sense of hope for the future into the campaign. And she added it would be a, quote, massive electoral blunder for the SNP to, quote, soften its left of centre environmentalist credentials. And I think this is very interesting. What did you make of it, Sam?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to this, actually. Very interesting story, very frustrating story in many senses. Firstly, relating to Sturgeon's criticism of the 2026 SNP campaign, yeah, I feel like you don't have to be a fan of John Swinney to concede that, even if you believe that he has failed in almost all respects. It's clear that he succeeded in at least giving a sense of stability on the SNP ship, leading into the 2026 election, which they got a very good result in, which Sturgeon concedes, right, in this forward. After the crisis of legitimacy, really initiated precisely by Sturgeon's resignation as First Minister and by the ensuing Operation Branchform, right? So I think there's an irony there. And also her view expressed in this forward that there was a lack of vision and big picture thinking in the SNP's 2026 campaign, ironically to me, also seems quite compatible with her own 7.5-year tenure as First Minister. And in fact, it really defines the SNP since 2014 when she took over. And is a lack of vision and big picture thinking, since 2014, I think, is reflected in this dramatic decline in membership, well, since 2019, that we've just been talking about, and in political participation, which Sturgeon herself clearly has played a role in. Secondly, I wanted to mention the Scottish Greens' invitation to Sturgeon to join the party. And this is to join the Greens, that is, given her plaudits of the Green campaign in this forward. And this is remarkable to me. I want to remind people that Nicola Sturgeon was married to a man that embezzled hundreds of thousands of pounds from the independence movement, which the Greens consider themselves a part of in Scotland. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole speculative psychodrama about whether Nicola Sturgeon herself was aware of this, although I will say it is surely an indictment of her competence as party leader if she was completely oblivious to this theft, but let's not get into that. But the point is, for the Greens, from a branding perspective, why would you want that association? Why would you want to absorb the questions from the media and from political opponents and absorb an association with this massive embezzlement scandal that they, at this point, don't have any association with, right? It doesn't make sense to me from a political perspective. So the invitation is a bit bizarre. Final thing, Cole. On this program last week, we discussed the massive process of wealth extraction currently taking place in Scotland's renewables sector, with hundreds of millions of pounds leaving the country into the coffers of Chinese and French and state energy companies and US private investment banks that actually own big shares in Scotland's wind farms. This is according to a report by the Ferret, which we discussed last week. Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister for 7.5 years, right? and did very, very little to pursue Scottish state ownership of its own energy resources. And her legacy is in large part that only 1% of Scotland's onshore wind capacity is owned by communities, whereas in Denmark, developers are required, mandated to offer communities at least 20% stake in new wind farms. And in Germany, 40% of renewable capacity is citizen owned, right? So why is this a legacy that the Greens want to be associated with? I don't understand it. From what it seems to me, what's happening with renewables now could end up being a repeat of the North Sea saga, the disastrous extraction of wealth from North Sea oil, which Scotland has ended up seeing a very pitiful share of compared to other oil rich countries. Except that this time it's much worse because renewables is a genuine industry of the future, from my point of view. And let's be real, Sturgeon oversaw that, right? So, and I don't see why the Greens would want to be even more accountable for it than they already are, given they were also in government during parts of that period, right? So that's some of my thoughts on it, Carl. What have you been thinking about this whole drama?
Yeah, I think you've said a lot of what I had planned to, Sam, and you're absolutely right. I think it's worth just dwelling on the Greens' response. Writing in the National, Gillian Mackay said, "Nicola has not joined the Scottish Greens, and as welcome as she would be, we do not expect her to. But since Nicola left office and we left government, that kind of bold, ambitious policy making has slipped into reverse. Yet hope matters not only for politics but for building support for independence." Sturgeon, however, has, of course, ruled out the prospect that she's going to join the Greens. She said she was SNP to her core. I think that none of this is particularly surprising. I think that her comments regarding John Swinney are particularly interesting because I think that, and this is not necessarily to give John Swinney credit, but as you acknowledge, Sam, if you recall some of the announcements which came out around the SNP's election campaign, such as the price controls suggestion, that is a big idea, and it is an economic idea, and it is something which began a debate about how we should try and control shocks in the economy to the basic essentials, right? And obviously, that idea has fallen by the wayside, and the SNP haven't delivered on it. We knew they were never going to deliver on it. We knew it was a election gift and nothing more. But it's more than Nicola Sturgeon committed to in her election campaigns previously, more radical proposal for economic intervention than arguably we had seen Sturgeon put forward in the 2021 election, for example. So I think that there's a debate about whether her criticisms are actually accurate in the first instance. But I think politically, it tells you all you need to know about the constraints of Scottish Green politics and how shallow it is when it comes to economic questions. Because to be so ready to align oneself with the Sturgeon agenda is to accept the sanctity of foreign direct investment as the primary driver of the Scottish economy. It is to accept the legacy of Scotland, as you said, of the Nature Scot PFI deal, rather than to challenge that, is to accept the successive rounds of cuts budgets that were passed on Nicola Sturgeon's watch, rather than to oppose it. So I think this is an interesting example of the Greens' failure to do left-wing populism, and instead is indicative of the extent to which ultimately they have these technocratic instincts, which says the credibility which can be gained by Nicola Sturgeon joining the Greens and by us winning Nicola Sturgeon's voters is better than the cost to our political prestige. With that, I think we should move on to our final story of the week because I'm conscious of time, and that is a brief update, of course, on the ongoing Scottish Labour leadership election. Nominations have opened in the contest, and none of the three candidates, Michael Mara, Monica Lennon, and Joe Fagan, had yet met the threshold to make it onto the ballot paper. Monica Lennon has the backing of the required two trade unions. Both Unison and Unite have nominated Monica. However, she lacks the three MPs and MSPs required to get on the ballot. She has two MPs and two MSPs at this moment in time. Both Joe Fagan and Michael Mara have the requisite number of parliamentarians, but both lack union endorsements. No union has yet backed either candidate. This week has seen candidates begin to announce their policy agenda, and given the conversation we've just had about climate change, it will come as little surprise that we are going to be critical of Joe Fagan professing that he will not stop lobbying Andy Burnham to approve Rosebank. Michael Mara also threw his weight behind the largest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. Monica Lennon, on the other hand, took to the Morning Star to outline a pitch to the left of the party and proposed to lead an organisation rooted in the principles of democratic socialism. So contour lines beginning to emerge in the contest. I've got a couple of things to say here, but I will throw to you, Sam, before we wrap up.
And I will. I think I'll defer to your commentary on this call. And it's interesting to see the contours of the leadership candidates forming. I think it would be. I think it would be a disaster if Monica Lennon did not get the requisite support in order to run. I think it's very important that there is a that there's a kind of diverse process, that there's diversity in the leadership process. The only thing I wanted to point out is I think that Anna Sarwar made some comments earlier today about the Scottish Labour leadership being the hardest job in British politics, which I think is actually quite astute from him in a particular sense. I think there's a case there. But the question I would ask is, why is it the hardest job in British politics? And maybe that merits a whole podcast in and of itself. I mean, the short answer is that everyone fucking hates the Labour Party, and the Labour leadership have not done a very good job in mitigating the fact that everyone fucking hates the Labour Party. But that's all I'll say on that topic, Cole. And I'm interested to hear your much more substantive analysis of this ongoing election.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say, other than this observation regarding the divergence between the political preference of Scottish Labour's trade union affiliates and public office holders within the party. We are potentially going to reach a situation where no candidate gets on Scottish Labour's leadership ballot paper as a result of this divergence. Monica Lennon has the unions, the other two don't. Monica Lennon doesn't have political representatives, the other two do, is the broad thrust of the contest as it stands just now. And I think what this really speaks to is the legacy of the Starmer project in Scotland, because what we are witnessing play out is the consequence of allowing gerrymandered selections at the 2024 general election to take place. That process ensured party loyalists were installed in every seat in Scotland, barring one or two, literally one or two. And the result is that come this contest, those MPs put their instinctive career interests far before the interests of the organised working class, here represented by the trade unions, who express a distinct political preference for which they have no interest, for which they have no real time and pay no heed to. If the political capital of affiliated trade unions is so limited within the Labour Party that MPs barely take cognizance of it, that's a really damning indictment on the composition of the Westminster crop in particular, because they are the ones who, to a greater extent than Holyrood, were handpicked by Starmer loyalists at the time, and who, let's not forget, in the vast majority of cases, took sizable donations from Labour Together, the much maligned Starmer think tank, which did a whole host of things, including surveilling journalists. So there's a lot of factors at play here. The thing I would say, and this perhaps speaks to the dynamic that I've just outlined, is the failure, I think, so far, to be fair, of any candidate to answer the question of who Scottish Labour is for and who Scottish Labour should represent. Because I think that's the core question regarding whether the party sinks or swims. The data that we have from May's election suggests Scottish Labour's crop of voters, the rump that's left, is middle-class professionals with degrees who own their own homes. That's not the working class, right, in the main. So how do Scottish Labour win back voters who are the precariat, who are post-industrial unemployed, who are in these categories, and is it possible for them to do so, right? Michael Mara has talked about the moral imperative of the Labour Party. Well, surely in this moment, the moral imperative of the Labour Party is to first work out what the Scottish working class is, what it looks like, and how it is composed, and then devise a strategy by which to win it back. That should be the job of any party which professes to be not even democratic socialist, socially democratic. And yet that's not on the agenda. And that speaks to a broader absence of analysis within Scottish politics about what the contemporary working class looks like, I think. Um, and that's a real problem when we're having these conversations, and it means that they become total bubble talk. It means that you get meaningless platitudes from candidates like a change of direction, renewal, regeneration. I mean, all of them are warning about the prospect of electoral oblivion as if that hasn't happened times and times over in the last 10 years. I mean, we're well beyond the point of electoral oblivion. I can't think of a superlative worse than oblivion at the moment, but it's that, and yet none of them seem to realize. So I think this contest is interesting in that regard. Monica Lennon did say something interesting, I think, in a Sunday Mail column today, suggesting that this was the most important moment in Scottish Labour's history, and I think that's probably true, purely for the fact that get this wrong and I can't see a viable future for the party, and it's an open question whether get this right and there is a viable future for the party, I think. And that's sort of the challenge all of these candidates have, is the air of despondency surrounding the party. And friend of the pod, Ewan Gibb, said something particularly insightful, I think, on Twitter earlier today when he pointed out that the Scottish Labour Party occupies this outsized influence with regards our political discourse because of its historic relevance to Scotland and to devolution, because it was the place, we live in the place rather, where votes for Scottish Labour were weighed rather than counted. And yet today Scottish Labour is a marginal force within Scottish politics, the joint second largest party at Holyrood. The organisation has barely 15,000 members, I suspect closer to 10, and yet still it occupies this historic place within our political imagination. And I think when our political imagination catches up to reality, that's when the alarm bells really start to ring for Scottish Labour, because that's when the reality, the skeletal nature of the party is going to be revealed for all to see, and history stops being the sort of defense that it has been for the party up until this point. On that note, we will leave it because we're approaching the 40-minute mark. Sam, it's been a pleasure as always. Nest of Fearties will be back in a few weeks' time. We haven't released an episode for a while over the summer, but it is in the process of being produced. News from Nowhere will be back in your inbox on Monday morning. Thanks very much for listening. As ever, you'll find us on Patreon, where you can support us for the price of £5 a month. See you later.